Hello, everybody. This is Eric Anderson again, and we want to welcome you to Wrestling with the Law again. I'm Eric Anderson, as you can see, sin lawyer. Obviously, as you can see, I'm green screening this today. We are in our home studio, if you will, which presently has undergone a little bit of a renovation. So I apologize for the look on the screen that we're getting right about now. What we want to talk about, obviously, is, as we've mentioned, there are recent events that took place here in professional wrestling, and they weren't good. There was a release or a notice, if you will, of people who were finding out that there had been a history of, or I should say, a history of bad conduct, some of which has been acknowledged by some of the people who were accused, and also a series of allegations of conduct. And it was very clear that there have been, at some point, a set of sexual harassment issues that have drawn up along the wrestling scene. So this raised a question that we've gotten from a variety of people. And the question we've gotten from many is, what are some of the things we can do in the wrestling business to make this better? Now, probably these policies probably already exist at the big companies, I would think. The WWE should have a policy, AEW should have a policy, but a lot of other people may not know what to do. After all, you think of yourselves as small companies. But what we're discovering is that even a small company can still be held liable. And you still also have the problem of creating an atmosphere that is not either conducive to being a productive company, is not conducive to learning, is not conducive to a safe environment. Let's talk about a couple of changes that took place. I had the chance to speak recently on I believe it was the Irish Whip podcast. And one of the things I talked about is that we have more women in the business in positions of good wrestling talent than we've seen ever before, at least here in the States. And part of that, I think, has been one of the reasons why there is less tolerance for this kind of conduct. Another thing to remember is that you are adding to your locker room people who have a different consideration than you had before. And because of that, you want to make sure that you have a safe environment. If you don't, there are going to be problems. So first, let's talk a little bit about what sexual harassment is. Mm-hmm. Now, sexual harassment includes a variety of conducts, but here are a few that I think pop up in the wrestling business a lot. That are sexual pranks, teasing, jokes, verbal abuse of a sexual nature, physical touching of a sexual nature, and giving sexually suggestive gifts. Now, this is where you find a lot of people who will think, look, I was just joking, I was just kidding. And wrestling is famous for its ribs. I mean, and some of the things that people do now are actually tame compared to some of the things we used to see before. I mean, defecating in people's shoes was a specialty of Johnny Valentine, for example. But again, those days are over. We're in a different time period now. It's also extremely important for you to remember that when you're coming into this environment, that which may seem normal and everything to you and your buddies, when you get new talent that comes in, may not seem normal to them. And so you have to be careful because sexual harassment can pop up either as it can be repetitive or it can be from a singular incident. Now let's talk about what we mean by that. For example, if there's someone who is a part of your company, and by your company, I'm including those wrestling students, okay? Including wrestling students who've come in, and they are consistently being, well, for lack of a better word, hit upon. They're being approached either with repetitive sexual jokes or with repetitive innuendos or with repetitive request for a relationship that isn't happening. That kind of conduct is indeed pervasive. And it is one of the things that can lead to a successful sexual harassment suit. You have to remember, any company you own, even if they're independent contractors, they are going to be people who need to be protected by you as a company owner. And that certainly includes your wrestling students. So because of that, you want to avoid the lawsuits and you want to make sure that you avoid the bad reputation and you want to make sure that you keep a safe environment. Now, what might be what we call a singular incident? A singular incident that can be so egregious it shocks the conscience. Well, some people are going to hear what I'm about to say, and it's going to sound like, well, duh, of course. Everyone should know that. Whipping out your penis, whipping out your breast, showing your various parts of your body, genitalia, etc., unsolicited. These would be incidents that shock the conscience. Trapping someone in a corner and rubbing up against them, that would be egregious and would shock the conscience. The slap on the ass, that can be egregious and can shock the conscience. So you want to make sure that those things aren't allowed. Now, in addition to this, one of the thoughts is, as a company, how do you lay all of this out? Well, it's very simple. You need to have a written sexual harassment policy with a clear scope of who it covers and what it means. So No sexual harassment policy is even written is going to be able to cover all of the plethora and the whole range of sexual harassment issues that are out there and sexual misconduct. But you want to try and keep it as detailed as possible. You want to point these things out. And part of that is with a written policy, you have it laid out there. The other thing is this: anybody who wants to come work for you for a show, anybody who wants to be a student, anybody who wants to be a trainer, anybody who wants to be a referee, anybody who wants to be an announcer, anybody who wants to be ring crew, anybody who wants to be tech support, anybody who wants to handle the merchandise, anybody who wants to handle the marketing. Are you seeing where I'm going? Everybody involved with you should be given a copy of the sexual harassment policy. They should also acknowledge in writing that they have received a copy of that policy and that they will make themselves aware of what is in that policy. And you need to have those acknowledgments on record. This serves two purposes. One, for litigation, or just for managing your company. In the event someone does something and they say, how was I supposed to know that was against the rules? You're able to point out and say, look, you signed on to this policy. You were supposed to read it. And if they say, well, I didn't read it. Well, no, you said you would. And you knew what our rules were. And because you violated that rule, now there has to be a disciplinary measure. We're going to talk about disciplinary measures in a few moments. Now, in addition to that written policy, you want to make sure that you have a complaint and reporting procedure. So what does that mean? It means that people need to feel safe that they can report what they think is misconduct or what they also believe is an uncomfortable working environment or learning environment. So you need to make sure that it is laid out who they can report to, what happens when it's reported, how investigations are done, and once those investigations are done, what's the feedback that they get regarding it? What are their rights to report? Can people report anonymously? No. You should probably have a procedure in which they can. And you thought maybe, well, how do we do this? We strongly recommend that you need to have an independent evaluators as part of your investigative group. So, for example, you need somebody, obviously at some point, everything has to come to the boss, the owner. Now, your question is, well, what happens if the owner is somebody who is alleged to have engaged in misconduct? Well, that's why you want to have independent evaluators. Because if you have independent evaluators, then part of your policy can be that if the owner or management is somebody who is suspected or being alleged to have conducted themselves in an inappropriate manner, then what you get to do is you then get to have an independent party who then handles that part of the investigation. This is extremely important because people have to feel comfortable. And if the boss is the one who is always in charge of what is going on, then we're going to see a little bit of a problem. Okay? So you want to make sure that that doesn't happen. Now, in addition to having independent evaluators, we also want to make sure that you add women. One of the advantages of adding women to the reporting process, and my recommendation is that the women on the process shouldn't be too connected to the boss. Okay, they shouldn't be the boss themselves. They shouldn't be the, or I should say, it shouldn't be the only present. Shouldn't be the only female. Shouldn't be the boss herself. Shouldn't be a spouse or girlfriend of an owner. You want to make sure that there's a mix in there, and the reason for that is because let's face it, many of these reports are going to come down to women, and they're going to need to have someone comfortable with women to be able to talk with them. And it's just natural that this is part of that process. The other thing is they're more likely to understand what they're going through. It's just fair. Now, this is not to say that women can be the only victims of sexual harassment. That is not what we were saying, and that should not be in your policies. This should be with anybody. As we know, there can be a variety of homophobic, transphobic, a variety of other kinds of comments that are going to be made or actions that will be taken. So it could be anybody in there. The more diverse your group, the better. You want to make sure, because remember, your number one issue is making sure that whoever the person is who has suffered a harm, that they feel comfortable that they were heard, that the issue was addressed, and that they knew that there would be no retaliations. And that's the other thing, too. You have to make sure that your policy includes that there are no retaliations. People shouldn't get in trouble for reporting. Now, in addition to that, this is important for your schools. You need to ban trainer-student relationships that are not pre-existing. Now, there's someone who is, and let's go through why this is a problem. First of all, there's a good chance that the wrestlers who are trainers are going to be seen as higher. They're going to be seen as more powerful, they're more experienced. Many cases may even be more charismatic. Many cases, they already have names. They've made a name on themselves either in the independent circuit or someplace else. That relationship can become a power dynamic problem very easily. And we have no problem saying this. Sometimes people have gotten themselves into relationships in which they didn't see themselves as having an improper power dynamic, but they do. And they realize it later on, and that's problematic. So what you want to make sure of is that you just ban those completely. Now, if two people were already involved before the student became a student and before the trainer became a trainer, then that's different. But for anything else, you need to ban them. You need to make sure that that does not happen. Now, something else. Applications should include background information. If you're having a wrestling school, there needs to be an application. Many of you have them. You put them on file. You ask about somebody's physical history. You ask about their experience. You ask if they have any prior, pre-existing medical conditions that might require special attention. Well, it's time to ask these questions too. Have you ever been convicted of a felony? Have you ever been convicted of a sexual-related crime? Have you ever had to leave? Have you ever been fired from a job? What are the reasons for that? Now, you want to make sure to keep all this information confidential, but you want to make sure that you've covered the bases, including, do you have to register as a sex offender? Have you ever had to register as a sex offender? Now, this doesn't mean that you can't still hire people who fit in those categories, but you now have the information about these people where you can then make a decision as to whether or not you want to run that risk. You do not want to go ahead, put these people in positions in which they have access to the public or to part of your staff, and then it comes out later. That doesn't make you look good, doesn't make the company look good, doesn't make the business look good. And more importantly, it is one of the things that can make the people who are working there feel unsafe. Now, we also want to make sure as well, we've talked about this a little bit, you want to define sexual harassment by its language and by example. What we mean by that is you want to make sure that you're pointing out where the languages of sexual harassment appear. You shouldn't be tossing around words like the C word. Oh yeah, I see our green screen is popping back and forth. C word, you don't want to see that tossed around willy-nilly. B word, you don't want to see that tossed around willy-nilly. Sexual language, willy-nilly, you don't want to see that. So have those. Now, again, we're mentioning this is not going to cover everything. Your manual can't be that large to cover everything. But if you're able to give examples as well of bad conduct. Now, you may be asking, Eric, how in the world do I find out what is bad conduct? Well, I've got news for you. Not only are there training videos all over the place, the internet, your payroll provider, talk to the people who've gone through it. There are many people who will tell you, look, I went through this experience at this location, and it made me feel unsafe. Those would be great examples. Also, you need to make sure that you have a disciplinary procedure and you make it plain. In the event you find that someone has engaged in a misconduct, a violation of your code of conduct, what do you do about it? Well, it should be laid out what happens. Does someone get suspended from the school or from the company? If so, for how long? Is there a pay suspension? If so, for how long? Is there a point where there's a year-long suspension? Is there a permanent ban? These are all things you need to decide and figure out, and it needs to be in writing. And the reason for that, including whether or not there's a procedure for people to follow. In other words, does the accused get a chance to be heard? It's perfectly fine to have a procedure in which the accused has a chance to be heard. You should have that, and then weigh the consequences. Excuse me. Now, the other thing that's important is post the policy in more than one place. Yes, I know we've already told you they should have a copy of it. Yes, I know we have already told you that what needs to happen is they need to be able to see that they've signed on to the policy. But you also need to have the policy posted because you need reminders all the time. It's important to remember a lot of people in this business, unfortunately, are what? Many of them are in great shape. Many of them are high energy. It's fair to say hormones can sometimes run wild, and good judgment doesn't run wild because oftentimes people forget it's a business like anything else. A lot of people want to be wrestlers or in the wrestling business because they don't want a, quote, real job. Well, it's time for you to run your company like it's a real company. So you've got to make sure that you have, just like you have at almost any job you work, OSHA warnings and wage and hour law warnings. You need to have the same thing for your policy. Put it up in more than one place. And finally, be consistent. If something was not proper for student A or for wrestler A, it is not proper for student B or wrestler B. Once you've established the precedent, once you've established the policy, you have to stick with that precedent and that policy, no matter how painful it's going to get. You can't have your biggest star being able to get away with something merely because they're your biggest star. To do so would be an insult not only to the company, but also be an insult to the people who you're working for, be an insult to your fans. So don't do that. So let's go back through these very quickly. As we said, number one, you want to make sure that you have a written sexual harassment policy with a clear scope of who it covers and what it means. Number two, you want to make sure you have a complaint and reporting procedure that is clear and that it's plain. Number three, you want to make sure that you have independent evaluators as part of the investigative group, not just the people in the company, but people who are outside the company as well. Number four, add women. And while we're at it, don't be afraid to add people from the QT. I'm sorry, I probably get those letters wrong all the time. Community, have them out there as well. It's really important. Also, make sure you ban the trainer-student relationships that are not pre-existing. Also, applications should include background information. Number seven, define sexual harassment by language and by example. Number eight, have a disciplinary procedure and make it plain. Number nine, post the policy in more than one place. And number 10, be consistent. Now, there's one other thing that I almost forgot to mention. I apologize about that. And that is people who are under the age of 18, when you bring them into the school or the company, must never be unaccompanied, ever. Make their parents responsible to keep an eye on them, or you have someone who's assigned to watch them, period. There needs to be a safe factor there. I don't care how mature they seem. I don't care how much older they've gotten. You can't put them in the environment with the adults. Things are going to go crazy. So you've got to make sure you watch all of this. All right. Now, if there are any other questions that you have, anything else you need to know, you can always go ahead and contact us over at, oh, geez, I thought I had this already set. You can go ahead and make sure you catch us over at, there it is, www.edalaw.com. You can speak to either myself or to my colleague, Sean Cork, on this matter or any other business law-related matters we deal with. We also deal with criminal law as well, but that's not what we're talking about at this particular time. All right, I want to thank everybody for joining us. We wanted to go ahead and get through this as quickly as possible. For those who are also wondering about the interviews we've been doing as part of WrestlingWithTheLaw.com and Wrestling with the Law series, we do have about 6 interviews that are in the can. We have to finish editing them. The fault lies with myself. A lot that's been going on, including me leaving for a while for my grandmother's funeral. So we want to thank everybody. We look forward to seeing you all again. In the meantime, remember, whatever it is you're wrestling with, come over here and let's wrestle with it together. Thank you.